Hi guys. Last sources that we're going to annotate. Source 11 is the United States House of Representatives debate over the Civil Liberties Act, conference report on H.R. 442, 1988. Remember, we're still answering the question, how did Japanese internment conflict with the U.S. Constitution? So we're going to read some back and forth from what representatives are saying in front of the House. Mr. Glickman says, Mr. Speaker, this is a great day for America because it bears witness to the unique and special greatness of America that we are today, repaying American citizens for injustices suffered during World War II as a result of denial of due process. So we can see Mr. Glickman is for the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 that we previously read in source 9 and 10. Very few other societies or countries would do what we Americans are doing today. Mr. Speaker, this bill proves our respect for human rights and liberties is paramount. I highlighted that because it seemed interesting. We have previously read that internment was a violation of human rights, just in source 10. And now Mr. Glickman is arguing that the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 is proving that America really cares about human rights. This bill also establishes a historical precedent that this will never happen again to any racial, religious, ethnic group or individual, that those folks will be deprived of due process because of their background. So I just want you to think about, has this been true? Has this happened to any racial, religious, ethnic groups or individuals that you know of? I want to show you a few headlines that I have bookmarked here. And I'm not going to read the whole source, I'm just going to read the headlines. This one says, "My rights have been violated," one of the last phrases of a Cuban woman who died in a Louisiana prison. And this headline from the ACLU states, U.S. resident indefinitely detained without charge secures his day in court, meaning that he did not receive due process of law. And last one, U.S. citizen freed after nearly a month in immigration custody, family says. If we go back to our source, Mr. Speaker, behind me is a statement by Daniel Webster. He closes the remarks by saying, and let us see whether we in our day and in our generation may not perform something worthy to be remembered. We are doing that today. Then we hear from U.S. Representative Coble. He says, Mr. Speaker, I yield myself my remaining 4 minutes. Mr. Speaker, I am not comfortable rising to oppose this bill because some will accuse me of being insensitive and uncaring. It is inaccurate. Many proponents of the bill are members of this House for whom I have the highest regard, and that compounds my discomfort. I cannot argue to my colleagues that this legislation does not represent a humane gesture by the United States, nor can I argue that Americans of Japanese descent who were living on the west coast of the United States did not experience a horrendous and regrettable interruption of their lives and livelihoods during World War II because of the relocation program. So 2 things to note here. One, he agrees that internment was bad, but he uses language like an interruption of their lives and the relocation program. So again, thinking back to the way our government used language to downplay what they were doing, we can see some similarities in how Mr. Coble is using language. I can, however, argue, Mr. Speaker, that in a time of war when a country is threatened for its very survival, as this country was after Pearl Harbor in 1942, many things happen and many lives are disrupted for no logical reason. So he's arguing that war makes bad things happen. It interrupts lives. And that's just the nature of war. Many travesties of justice occur during a time of war. Many people lost their lives during World War II. Many people's lives were disrupted against their will, and this country went to war in order to help stop the further loss of lives. So this kind of makes me think of the two sources that we saw, which argued that internment was for their own good. So ultimately, war disrupted them, but it also protected them. I believe it is unfair and perhaps even presumptuous for us to sit in the calm of this house, thousands of miles away from any threat of war today, with the benefit of 2020 hindsight, and pass judgment of the decision made by President Roosevelt, his Secretary of War, and other members of his cabinet during the threat of war which faced them in 1942 following the attack on the front line of defense at Pearl Harbor. So basically he's arguing it's easy for us to say that it was bad, but how would they have acted in 1942 as we were being bombed? Was there perhaps war hysteria? No doubt. Was there perhaps racial prejudice involved? No doubt. Was there a failure of political leadership? I think not. We joined that war and helped our allies win it. So he goes to the conclusion of the war. We won the war. But the decisions which are being questioned today, Mr. Speaker, were entwined with a threat in national security. I furthermore have reservations about the precedent that we may be setting in passing legislation of this kind. So he's saying that this law is setting an example. I do not believe that this government can make restitution for every wrong committed by it during a time of global war. And where do we draw the line? Perhaps descendants of slaves, perhaps American Indians who were forced from their ancestral grounds and placed upon reservations. The potential is endless. I highlighted this section because there is talk of reparations for descendants of slaves. And I want you to think about that. Do you think that that's logical? Do you think that that's fair? Do you think that that's realistic? The potential is endless. Our office has received many letters from our veterans who fought in the Second World War who disagree with this bill, and the tone of their letters is generally the same. Many of them fought and were injured in World War II in conflict with our enemies. Some lost friends and loved ones as a result of the attack upon Pearl Harbor. Mr. Speaker, in closing, I have no problems with the United States apologizing for those citizens of Japanese descent. So he's kind of saying an apology is enough. People lost their lives. Japanese people were just interned. So an apology is enough. Who were interned during the Second World War or whose lives were disrupted and detrimentally so during that war. And there are, furthermore, many people who should be recipients of apologies for acts that were done to them during the time of war. But it is a problem, Mr. Speaker, that cannot be simply and summarily resolved after the fact through legislation. So a law isn't really going to change what happened. So why bother? Our last source for this inquiry is George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. Presidential apologies for the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, 1988 and 1933, respectively. So we can see our presidents, too, are apologizing. So President George H.W. Bush is on the left. He says, a monetary sum and words alone cannot restore lost years or erase painful memories. Neither can they fully convey our nation's resolve to rectify injustice and to uphold the rights of individuals. We can never fully right the wrongs of the past, but we can take a clear stand for justice and recognize that serious injustices were done to Japanese Americans during World War II. In enacting a law calling for restitution and offering a sincere apology, your fellow Americans have, in a very real sense, renewed their traditional commitment to the ideals of freedom, equality, and justice. You and your family have our best wishes for the future. On October 1st, 1993, President Bill Clinton states, over 50 years ago, the United States government unjustly interned, evacuated, or relocated you, and many other Japanese Americans. Today, on behalf of your fellow Americans, I offer a sincere apology to you for the actions that unfairly denied Japanese Americans and their families fundamental liberties during World War II. In passing the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, we acknowledged the wrongs of the past and offered redress to those who endured such grave injustice. In retrospect, we understand that the nation's actions were rooted deeply in racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and a lack of political leadership. We must learn from the past and dedicate ourselves as a nation to renewing the spirit of equality and our love of freedom. Together, we can guarantee a future with liberty and justice for all. You and your family have my best wishes for the future. Go ahead and answer your questions either on Edpuzzle or up in the right-hand corner if you are watching on YouTube. Make sure that you're checking on the collaboration station tab on the Weebly for your final task.